Good morning everyone. Still morning? Yeah, it's still morning. How is everyone? Good? Good, okay. I was just sitting through Daniel's presentation then, and my mind is fucking blown. So I'm going to preface this by saying that most of what you see here will be quite simple. I am focusing on the monitoring side of things. We'll go through a few case studies, and a lot of what I present is hypothesis. Okay, so a lot of these things are things that I've seen over a number of years that I feel may offer you some insight and some help in diving into your monitoring, particularly looking at that enormous word there, neuromuscular status. The cohort that we're looking at is obviously elite rugby players. So I live in Galway in the west of Ireland and work with Connacht Rugby, one of four provincial teams underneath the Irish national team. We'll get into that in a second. A little bit on me, just why I might be here. So as Laurie mentioned, I've sort of been around the place. Grew up in Australia, grew up in Sydney, played rugby myself. As soon as I finished playing rugby and messing around as a greenkeeper and with getting my abilities and my ambitions completely mixed up in that sport, I went into coaching, and a mate of mine said, look, you should probably not be a rugby coach. You always like training. You can't hit rucks at 100 miles an hour and try and break fellas. You're not playing anymore, Dave. Go and get in the gym. And so I followed that path, and it's taken me all around the world now, quite literally. So from Sparta over in Menlo Park there, to then OKC and now Ireland after a few different journeys, a few different trips. I guess what got me interested mainly though in force and force production was when I was still an undergrad and moving into my honours research. I was doing a little bit of work with Jeremy Shepherd, who Daniel mentioned before, who was with Surfing Australia at the time. And the investigation that I was really interested in is, what sort of force production did a surfer have to create in order to complete what's the word that we used? A meaningful manoeuvre. What was the thing that was going to cause that major manoeuvre? Anybody hazard a guess? That's me, by the way. I was really good back then. I haven't surfed in years now. But anyone hazard a guess at what that sort of force level is? No? It's the force of the wave itself, right? So when we think about ground reaction force, if we want to overcome some sort of inertia, we have to apply more force than that. That wave, depending on height, there's a really cool algorithm that a guy at the University of New South Wales told me, and I sat there and went, I don't understand anything about what you're talking about in fluid dynamics, but if I can make that board jam into that wave and create more force than that wave is, I'm probably going to complete a critical or a major maneuver. So we did that little test, and that just sort of inspired me. No force plates, no real solid sort of in-foot PETA soles or anything like that, just an accelerometer, and being able to work through that data together with Jeremy and think about that. So particularly as these World Tour events were going into 10-foot, 12-foot plus surf, and they're expected to do big cutbacks in that sort of water, you've got to be pretty damn strong. So it was a nice little learning for me. Where am I now though? I'm in beautiful west of Ireland. Like I said, this is Connacht Rugby. We are not the richest team. I'll put that out there now. I was talking to Blake about one of our guys' salaries, and he giggled at me this morning over coffee, so yeah, fuck you. I operate on a shoestring budget. One of the things that we do have is a pair of force plates and a pair of force decks and force deck software, so we get some tremendous value out of that. Alongside that though, I'm also studying at UTS, and I have two of my supervisors here in the room, in Blake and Dr. Daniel Cohen. So I apologise in advance to both of you. It's probably not going to be the best science you've ever seen, just throwing it out there. But working my way towards what will hopefully in a couple of years turn out to be a PhD. Give you a little bit of context in my circumstance. We have a performance science and an analytics program that we're focused on, and we have three main groups in our triad that we work together every single day. So If you can imagine, my daily flow is to come in the morning, is to meet with a coach, to meet with our head of medical services, and to go over some of our objective data to make sure that we're on point, make sure that we're going to have the best possible training session, that we're doing the best prep for the game that weekend against some pretty stiff competition with who we play against. So we look at three probably key areas. So our performance science, which I'll go into in more depth, that's sort of the area that I bring. Our game analysis and our training analysis, which comes from our analytics department, and then our player evaluation, which is usually our team manager looking at the players that we have at that point in time, what they might be able to contribute to the game on the weekend, the games coming up, and who we might need to recruit over the next number of years. I guess the really important part to this, and it's nice having a triangle and all that sort of stuff, but we reference our triad. We reference specifically in all our discussions, how can we be a better interdisciplinary team, and how can we put our objective measures at the centre of that? How can we make sure that we're not just coming in there and living on can you feel it island, or did you see that mountain? You know, like no one gives a shit what you saw or what you felt. What can we measure? What can we be really set up on? And then go and talk about our feelings and what we've seen after that, being informed. So our performance science program is obviously athlete-centered. I say obviously, but I think all of you know that, you know, and probably do it in your practice. If you don't, I'd say it's probably a good way to go. We have a lot of stuff. I'm putting all this stuff up here. There's a lot of different things that sort of go into our performance science program. We draw as much data as we can from all the different things that we do. We try to do simple things. So when I say simple, it's the action for the athlete should be relatively simple. The simpler it is, the better execution they can have, the higher compliance they have, the more feedback we can give, the more immediate it can be, and the more they're able to perform. So that's our focus. Make it really, really simple. As Daniel referenced a few times there, everything simple has like an underlying complexity that we have to honour. We have to understand that complexity is underneath it, and we have to make sure that we're giving the guys the opportunity to learn that, but also giving them the confidence to then just perform on top of that, not get caught up too much in the weeds. So I'll show you through a few case studies in a little while on how we try and do that and how we try and create this environment where the guys hold themselves accountable, and we are literally able to get them to jump as high as they can 2 mornings a week, or every morning if we needed them to, and then go out and perform and train in that same manner. Now, there's a lot of different stuff that's going to come up right now, and it talks to this link between our medical department, our coaching department, and our S&C or physical departments, but then also with our front office, so all the guys who are making those decisions. We use our force plates in a lot of different ways. Like I said, we don't have much. What we do have, we try to use really, really well. And these are all things that we've gone through in the last 2 years, different measures that we're trying to build up databases on and understand at a greater level. But I guess the one that I'm going to focus in on today, and we've already talked about it quite a bit, is our counter movement jump. I'm sure you've probably seen some of these things. We might talk about them later today. They give you a richness of information, but there's that sort of, which paradigm do we put them in? Is this screening? Is it an assessment? Is it monitoring? Is it a test? You know, and we try and attribute the right language to those things. So for example, a time to stabilization is a screening movement for us. We want to know roughly at the start, how long does it take him to stabilize on 1 foot from a metre away, jumping over a small hurdle to land and stick on 1 foot, and what's the peak force that's associated with that. We could go down through all of these things. As I said, we're going to focus in on that CMJ though, because we do that a little bit more. Some background, what is neuromuscular status? So I'm going to, again, pretty simple when we think about it, where you get a training stimulus and you're either going to go towards a supercompensation or a fatigue effect. Immediate, acute, long-term, low frequency, all those sorts of terminologies is how we're going to attribute to fatigue. Supercompensation, growth, gains, getting jacked, whatever you want to say, right? But let's define fatigue just a little bit. So first, high frequency fatigue. It's that immediate response. So what we're getting in that 72 hours post, it's performance downturn in the presence of the following things: reduced availability of muscle glycogen, metabolic byproduct, perceptual fatigue, or their effort is high. You know, the perceptual effort is high. Think about that for when we might want to monitor that acute fatigue and see where that's going to turn around. Low frequency or persistent fatigue. So longer term downturn in performance post-exercise, so greater than 72 hours, where we've still got performance downturn in the presence of replenished muscle glycogen, ATP, CP, metabolic byproduct has cleared now, and perceptual fatigue or effort is normal. So when they're not tired anymore, they're still tired. You know what I mean? There's not that immediate response. So we want to just try and clear that up to understand what we're talking about, which part of neuromuscular status we're talking about. Pretty simple fitness fatigue models. Again, just talking about that fitness fatigue cycle, but then building into some of the stuff that Cootsy's worked on, is it's not as simple as one exposure. It goes up and down over time, and we want to try and understand where we are on those curves and how we're trying to create a longer term performance gain or peaking for critical parts of the season, which, given our result last weekend, maybe I fucked up. At least for the first 25 minutes, we were woeful. So just thinking about some of the aims for neuromuscular status monitoring. We want our measures to be reliable. We want them to be a relatively maximal task, as we've already discussed. We want there to be a neural contribution. We want there to be a muscular contribution. And we want it to be somewhat relative to performance. So if we were looking at sumo wrestlers, there's a couple of things on this page that might not be the best thing to measure their neuromuscular status. And there's going to be a couple of examples that we might want to think about when we are monitoring the neuromuscular status of a sumo wrestler. I don't know whether it's up in that left-hand side there. It could be. He looks pretty athletic for a fat fella. The two down the bottom look pretty shit. And the one up the top looks very specific. I might go towards something a little bit more up there. For us, for rugby players, we're looking at what is the relationship, well, what can we get the closest relationship to the task that they undertake. Our guys sprint hard, they go into collision. They jump, if they're in a line out, they need to come under some contact, they need to overcome some inertia. That counter movement jump is a pretty good fit for us, and some of the literature in that area, particularly going back to Hennessy and et al. Talking about the relationship between sprint performance and counter movement jump performance, there's a decent amount there. Now we know it's not perfect, but there is a reasonable relationship for what that slow stretch shortening cycle might be showing us. So we referenced it before, that slow stretch shortening cycle versus the fast stretch shortening cycle. We can go through that stretch shortening cycle model, the neuromuscular and mechanical models, but we're looking at those contributions to how we're going to perform on a daily or a weekly basis and where we're at in that cycle. My personal opinion on this is I like the CMJ using a slower stretch shortening cycle because it allows us just that little bit larger collection time. All the stuff that Daniel showed you before, being able to break down our eccentric and concentric components, being able to see some of that more phasic movement, to see how they're performing, what the changes are throughout the week, how that mechanical and neuromuscular model is interacting. It's a really nice way for us to get some of that complexity, but also have the simplicity of just saying, hey, jump as high as you can. The way I like to think about these variables, I like to break them into some pretty simplistic categories here. So forgive the sort of oversimplification, but we'll go through it. One category I like to think about, so our force and power categories. Mean, maximal, so we're measuring in newtons here. They show that maximal or average output in a task. So it's a little bit more sort of outcome based. They talk about more of our contractile components, our peripheral nervous system, what our overall motor unit recruitment is, right? So again, Daniel gave a much better description of this, and I feel like a dickhead for even putting this up here now, but I'll carry on anyway. Thank you, Daniel. Impulses, so our force times time, Newton seconds, represents total force created in a phase. Range of motion can be a big player here. And motor unit synchronization, so it's interesting, as Daniel was talking about, as guys get load on their back, they start creating greater impulses. Well, they've got to overcome a greater inertia, but also does that push them just that little bit deeper to have to come out of there and have a greater impulse? How do the motor units synchronize in order to create that motion as well? Our rates now, so force and power, so per second measures, watts, newtons per second per kilogram. They represent, for me, an explosiveness in our movement. So very simply, how quickly are we creating force? You know, Dan will probably get stuck into me for this, but you know, our rates of rates, you know, these power curves do go up over time. How quickly are they going up? How quickly are we getting towards those peaks? That speaks to me about explosiveness. So our series elastic components, our parallel elastic components, central nervous system, our rate coding, some of those measures in those 50 and 100 millisecond zones, they can be really interesting for us to understand our explosiveness and our rates of power of force development. Getting into some ratios now, so talking about how different variables interact with each other. Time-based primarily, so flight time to contraction time, talking about RPDs at different times. Dan will go into this a little bit more in his presentation this afternoon, but they explain to me the balance in a movement or between phases. So what's our coordination like? Again, what's our motor unit synchronization like? And then our outcomes. Probably not the best measure, but they're the thing that the athlete's going to resonate with the most. If you tell them to jump but don't tell them how high they went, it's pretty likely that they won't want to jump again. They can be used as performance indicators and categories. So if you go back to Cormie's research, and I loved, this is one of my favorite lines to my guys when they do come in the morning, particularly props. If you don't know what a prop is, it's a fat guy who hits people. I really, really like props. Cormie had a definition of jumper was over 50 centimeters and a non-jumper is under 50 centimeters. That's a really simple definition. And I like walking past guys who get a PB and they go like, oh, I got a PB today. Like, that's great, how high? 47 centimeters, that's not a jumper. Wait, what? What'd you say? Fuck off, fatty. So breaking some of these up now, these are the variables that we look at and that we track and that we monitor in our program currently. So getting into a little bit of the detail. In our eccentric phase, our rate marker, eccentric deceleration rate of force development. Our force and power, eccentric mean power. Impulse, eccentric decel impulse. And then our ratio, we're looking at an eccentric mean power to eccentric deceleration rate of force development. I'll show you why in a little while, but it was interesting to hear Daniel thinking about that force and velocity, you know, which way is which going, and thinking about power, but it also gave me another thought on eccentric decel, so we'll dive in there in a second. Isometric, so when I say isometric, I'm really probably focused on that zero velocity and interamortization sort of phase. So force and power, concentric mean force, as being a little bit of a descriptor of what's happening through that amortization phase. And then force and power, so force at zero velocity there again. What is that marker, and does that give me a good consistent marker in that space? Concentric rate of power development. I've already referenced Prue Cormie's work. I really like that measure, and again, we'll demonstrate why. Force and power, our concentric peak force is a pretty simple one, and then our impulse, our concentric impulse. Our outcome measures, two really simple outcome measures: jump height, flight time, contraction time. Flight time, contraction time being, again, just that overall descriptor of stretch shortening cycle. Important again, for us in our environment, we need to have good, consistent measures. So those protocols around your CMJ become really, really important. If you want guys to buy in, you need to have them in that same state and be able to demonstrate change. First off for us comes our jump prep. So what we want to do is get them ready to jump. That's the mindset that we're putting behind this. So before every test, we must have the following things completed. I know it's easy for me to say with a group of rugby players in the west of Ireland who are probably motivated. But again, I think if you can spend the time with your athletes and explain to them why this is important and why it gets them ready to jump, you do it at the same time every time you do it, so you're measuring apples with apples, I think you get in a much better spot. So really, really simple. Just getting them fired up, ready to jump. And then our actual jump protocol has to be maximal. All the things that we're seeing here. It's interesting the discussion around, like, do you teach the landing? We personally don't. We just ask that they land on the plates and that they stay on the plates after they land. They tend to default into that good deceleration phase. I also don't try and overcoach the jump because I want to see what their strategy is. What are they going to do today? Is it a little bit different on a Monday to a Thursday typically? Is it a little bit different when, you know, they're a little bit sore or a little bit less sore? You know, I want to see those changes over time. And as Drew alluded to, we probably want to get a little bit more of an idea of what that strategy is. For our purpose and for the purpose of my research, we keep hands on hips. I love that word, akimbo. It sounds awesome. But hands on hips, jumping as high as you can, trying to bang your head off the ceiling. And I got a little video of the boys a bit later on getting stuck into each other about that. Our pre-season testing. So when the guys come in our first week, we want to collect our baseline testing. So we start on Monday, day one. It's a training day. We have weights and conditioning on that day. First thing in the morning, we do our first jump test. We go again on Tuesday, which is interesting for the research, for the reliability research that we're doing at the moment. It's interesting seeing the interplay between some of these days and how those CVs changes between some of these days. Day 4, we'll go again their next training day. They've got an off day on Wednesday, and then we'll follow up again that following Monday. What we're finding at the moment, and again, bear in mind this research is yet to be published, the data exists, but it's yet to be published. So the reliability that we're getting out of these measures on Tuesday to Thursday being somewhat the most similar days in terms of training, our CVs seem to be just a little bit tighter in this condition. The second is taking the 3 days and looking at test-retest reliability over the 3 days. Again, seems to be the best. The worst out of the condition, Monday to Monday. And that's fairly typical. And that protocol is fairly typical in the literature as well, is to look at day one of week 1, day 1 of week 2, and see what the test-retest reliability is there. For our protocol, we look at an average of 3 jumps for each of our measures. So we take the average, and it really comes from this meta-analysis by Claudino et al. They found that the average jump results were more sensitive than the highest or the peak jump result. And they suggested that average CMJ performance without arm swing should be used to track neuromuscular status. That was their suggestion. I took that on face value and went with that with our guys. I think this is like the important point here is not to create what they're saying. What they're not saying is that this is not going to create necessarily the most reliable, particularly in measures like peak power, which tend to be most reliable from your best jump to your best jump because it's fairly static, or jump height, which the best tends to be the best. It's saying that it's most sensitive. And this is where I'd like to throw out a little bit of a challenge in that, you know, is it reliability necessarily that we need, or is it sensitivity that we're really after? But reliability being reliability. Some numbers that we've found from our research, and this is the 3-day reliability, so CV percentages on jump height, flight time, contraction time, force at zero velocity, versus some others that we've found in the literature. Stu Cormack, there's not big differences here. I don't want to overstate this, but if the level used in research is commonly 5% coefficient of variation, and we're seeing, you know, Stu Cormack taking that week to week and just the best jump height, 5.2% versus a 2.7, might be something in that. Flight time, contraction time, again, week to week, best jump, 6.1 versus 4.38. Whereas if you look at Rob Gathercole's work, looking at force at zero velocity, average of the best 4 jumps out of 6 jumps versus our 3, it's almost identical. And we're seeing maybe there's something in how you create your baselines and what sort of coefficient of variation you want to end up with in order to track these guys over time and see what's a sensitive variable. In season, we jump on a Monday, we jump on a Monday because we're always off on Sunday. This is the best thing about living in Ireland. I was saying to the boys before, they go like, oh no, look, we can't train on Sunday. We couldn't come in on a Sunday. They go, oh, is that, it's Irish, quite Catholic, religious, fuck off. Pints on Sunday. We're going to go for pints. So we come in on Monday and jump. I don't know how much alcoholism I'm measuring there, but probably a fair amount. And then we jump again on the Thursday, so game day -2. So you can see what I'm expecting after a Saturday night game, is this is in their acute fatigue phase. I'm expecting that there's still some residual acute fatigue, that they're still trying to sort themselves out soreness-wise, that they're still trying to move some of their metabolic byproducts on. But by Thursday, and after a decent regen day on a Wednesday, I'm hoping that they're pretty good to go. Because then they've got to transform into animals to go and run over people on Saturday and do it all again. So again, just that challenge, sensitivity, is that maybe more important than reliability? And if we look again, go back to that 5% that I threw up before, is there maybe something in an eccentric decel RFD at 10.94%, if it varies more than that coefficient of variation, if it varies consistently more, can it tell us a little bit more about this being an important variable? Concentric rate of power development, again, a little bit higher CV, over 5%, eccentric mean power, over 5% on that 3-day. But does it maybe show us a little bit more? And hopefully by showing you our monitoring systems, I can convince you that maybe it does. Maybe it gives us that insight that we're looking for. Maybe it tells us a little bit more about this guy's strategy and how they're changing and what we can do to help affect them. This is just a quick snapshot of our monitoring dashboard. So as Drew mentioned before, we're looking at sort of changes in standard deviations away from their mean. We take their average from the last 60 days and their tests over the last 60 days. So it does move over time to try and stay a little bit more current. We'll just get a basic highlight on what it is, might be down, what might be up, what's different. It doesn't tell us why. We get a little track on their asymmetry. And then for deeper investigation, we're able to look at a little bit more of a longitudinal sort of dashboard like this, dive into what might be a little bit off, a little bit different, and why, and then track their trends for all those variables over time. So this is just something that we built out in Excel. We take a download, dump it in there after looking at those graphs and giving those guys the immediate feedback on their jump height from a leaderboard, as you've seen behind the guy's head. Taking all of this, I want to run you again through these case studies. So this is the first one here. We're focusing in on one player, fractured his thumb as part of his RTP program, so his return to play program. We identified that his strength and explosiveness through squat predicted 1RM CMJ height, they were pretty trash, especially for the position that he was playing. So we began a 3-week program of super maximal eccentric training. So our S&C took him into a pretty brutal couple of sets. It's not a tremendous amount of work that he was doing, but it started to give us a little bit of a difference. And as this guy trained and kept on training, you can see over on the far right there, his jump height just kept on coming up. So it was 5.63 centimeters, that average of 3 jumps. We weren't deep into the season here, so I don't think this was a massive comeback from fatigue. As you can see by his baseline testing, I think he was quite normal at that point. Busted his thumb up and then started training quite a bit. What we noticed was that his concentric impulse was sort of up and down, no significant sort of trend, whereas his eccentric deceleration rate of force development was showing a definite upward trend over and above where his baseline and outside of that variation. So if again, just dive into some of the research, Lafay et al., they found a pretty strong correlation, reasonably strong correlation between eccentric RFD as a more accurate predictor of jump height, and suggested that maybe that preloading of that stretch shortening cycle might be a bit more of a driver for some people than others. I don't know whether it's universal, but certainly with this guy, we're seeing a lot more of that variation in jump height explained by what his EDRFD was at the time of those jumps. So for him, this seemed to be a pretty effective strategy. This might tell you a little bit about one of your athletes that needs to be able to create some more of that, motor unit recruitment and motor unit synchronization to be able to load up, pre-tension that stretch shortening cycle, and then be truly able to explode out. Case study 2, this is an interesting one. So again, hypothesis. This is a highly managed player, fast guy. We manage him because of his soft tissue injury, and we make sure that he doesn't sort of get too far over his loads too often. We're also, managing his very high speed running exposures. We're looking at trying to keep him away from soft tissue injury. We need him to be able to perform, because when he's on the field for us, he's electric. Game day -2, so Thursday, comes in, jumps a PB, best jump for the season. 60.8 was his peak. He averaged out at 59.4. Game day -1 the next day, he gets a low-grade soleus strain decelerating in a captain's run. So a captain's run is just a walkthrough. Game day, so just before the game, the day before the game, they go out, they're just jogging through plays. He's warmed up, he's good to go, and then bam, takes him out of the game. His jump height went up. Should be good, right? Should be okay. Flight time, contraction time ratio was up. Concentric impulse is pushing a bit harder. That's good. Concentric rate of power development's up. So like everything's good. Everything's going in the right direction. But what we saw was this sort of inverse movement. There's two different movements where his eccentric mean power came down, but his eccentric deceleration rate of force development went up. This eccentric mean power, this work that he's doing in that time. So like we said, force times velocity. We want to see how much work is being done, but then the speed with which that was happening, how quickly that less work was getting done, has gone up considerably. So think about it like an increase in stiffness. Now, if we see this now, particularly with this guy, if we see this change now, what we want to find out is that stiffness being created on purpose? Is that something that he's doing, that he's actively creating more stiffness? Or is it a passive stiffness that might be coming up in that, sort of lower limb, that distal lower limb? Is it something more towards the Achilles, towards that, is that particularly stiff right now? And can we affect that? Can we change that ahead of time so we don't get these shitty little injuries that take guys out of important games? It's a nice question to ask ourselves. For case study 3 and 4 here, I want to focus in just on as I was saying before, this concentric rate of power development. The reason I like this measure so much, when Prue Cormier did that original study, granted it wasn't in a total athlete population, but what she did find was that there is a significant difference between the jumpers and non-jumpers, so the athletes and the fatties. But then after a training block, it didn't change significantly. So training didn't seem to change concentric rate of power development significantly. And over time, what I've noticed as I look at this and I look at changes over time, what does seem to affect it is fatigue. So as guys get more tired, they become less explosive. What a shock. This case study is a high-level player. He's been playing consistently big minutes for our team. He also has a young family. One of his daughters is quite ill, and the other one is just a newborn. His son is a newborn. He'd been performing really, really well. He really is an excellent player. But the coaches started to notice some uncharacteristic errors in his game, little things like missing line-out calls, dropping a ball every now and again. When we discussed this, and after seeing this little trend coming out on the right here, we sort of sat down and I just said, hey, what's going on? I think it's right here. Yeah, right here we had a break. We had a week off. Yeah, we get weeks off in season. It's amazing. We had a week off, and he went away with his family. But during that week, both the kids were sick. His missus was into him. He had a miserable time, and he came back and was more tired than when he left. So the break didn't work. I didn't say that to him because I really like my week off. I'm not bringing the boys in on that week. So when he came back, he was actually a little bit more tired. But getting back into the routine, he seemed to improve a little bit, but then we just saw over a number of weeks, he starts to dip down into here. So I was just sitting down with him and I said, mate, why don't you not sleep in the same room as your wife and the kids? And he goes, oh, no, I can't do that. And I went, seriously, I think it will help. I think it will help your performance. I think you'll do a bit better. If you just go and get a bit of rest, I think you'll feel better. So we did 2 weeks. And over that 2 weeks, you can see a bit of performance improvement over on the right-hand side there, back up into baseline measures. This was some of the feedback that I sent him. So again, just talking about that EMP EDRFD ratio, he started pushing over to the right here, which is nice. That's really good, because I like to call those guys beasts, like high EDRFD and high EMP, like that's the beast zone. It's great. But he'd stabilised this. And it seemed that he was coming up into the critical end of the season. He's coming back up into his baseline. And after I sent him that, he gave me a call and he goes, you know what, I'm feeling a lot better. And he goes in to see the coaches and the reports are getting a little bit better. So he's not having those errors anymore. And we're going into the tail end of our season with one of our most important guys firing, which is really, really cool. Case study 4 now is probably the opposite to that guy who's highly experienced. We'll talk about a young fella, so a rookie. This is a guy who's coming out of an academy program, first year training full on in a pro program, relatively low training age, hasn't had this sort of game exposure. But as we look throughout the season, you can see he sort of dances around, he's doing quite well in the preseason, but as he goes, he starts tumbling down into here. Around about here, we sort of started talking to him about managing his energy, managing his time, making sure that he's recovering, being able to get back into games and perform at a high level. Still couldn't quite do it. Despite having those holidays, he's just sort of starting to fall off a little bit. But if you think about this, probably counterintuitively for a second, it's not necessarily that we want to stop that slide. Because over the years, he's got to get used to playing games late in the season. He's got to get a little bit better. So it's not necessarily that we wanted to pull way back on him and hold him back. It's actually, you know what, you are working hard. You are doing well. You are going to adapt. But this isn't a one-year gig. This is over time. At the moment, the trend is down. But over the years, hopefully we start seeing that coming up in the next 2 years as he gets a bit older and he is able to perform a little bit more. All of that's great. Some feedback there to the guys, but what do we do every day? How do we get these guys to hold each other accountable? Number one, to give their best effort, and then hopefully to learn a little bit about themselves and about what they're doing. So as you can see here, this is one of my fatties. He's taking a photo of his very mediocre jump height. This is just our testing area. It's not complex. Like I said, it's not like we're flush. Like we pull stuff together and we make it work, but this is really important to us, so we section it off. Just simple things like a little WhatsApp message on a Sunday, like, hey, just have a look at this, have a think about this. That's an interesting message on the right-hand side there. So this is a little bit about what Daniel said. This guy is a left winger, so he plays on the left-hand side of the field. He's left-handed, left-footed, like big left boot. And that left side asymmetry, when it starts to creep up, like start changing quite significantly, he starts to get like a little bit of a back issue, we found out. And so one Thursday night, I texted him and I said like, hey, just make sure you roll out your left leg, you look a little bit tight. And he comes back to me and goes, you know what? Like, what are you saying? I said, like, your left side's a little bit tight and I'm worried that your back's going to go because you start to twist a little bit that way, and we've seen that in the past. And he comes in the next morning and he's standing there talking to a bunch of guys, and I sort of walk over and he goes, come here, you fucking wizard. And I went, what are you talking about? And he goes, my back was fucking killing me all afternoon. I had no idea why. And I rolled out my leg and my back felt better. And he's standing there in amongst like 3 or 4 guys in his position. And they go, really? How did you know that? I didn't fucking know that, I guessed that. But if you get those little wins, it can start driving some of that culture. So if you use the information, you go back to your guys, you are communicating with them and you're giving them information regularly, not only will you drive the performance and drive the competition, which I'm going to show you in a second in terms of our environment. So guys taking photos of themselves to send to their mates saying, get in here and jump, you I won't say that word. You know, to having a space that is meant for that they identify with that they want to be in that space and competing. They want to compete at everything. They want to compete bloody eating their breakfast. But then also having something that they can action on. I think that's what creates a little bit more of that environment of actually getting up and jumping as high as you can. So this is just a quick snapshot of when Force Decks first came in, what our environment looks like in the morning. Bunch of Irish lads talking shit, getting stuck into each other, quick cusses, making sure that they're trying their best when they jump. Fast forward, year and 3/4 later, we've got pretty much the same thing. They're still crowding around that same screen, still looking at that leaderboard, still seeing who's jumped the highest ever, who's going to jump the highest this morning, getting stuck into each other. This goes on for too long. Tom's got a little message for me here, first thing in the morning. He's one of our hookers. We'll see it in a second.
Say hi, Tom.
You've got great respect for me. Fucking pricks. And then this, I think this is probably, I was sort of standing in my office, which looks at the monitoring space, and I saw these guys sort of all talking together, and I went over there and I said, look, just let me record you. So I didn't stage this, although they did play it up a little bit, but so this is like an up close. This is the boys giving it to each other, trying to cheat the test. We deleted that one, though.
Your legs straight, you dipshit.
That's like a lorry jump.
That's like rest. Into your nose. Not too much into it. Pressure down. Hit the fucking roof here. Pressure down. Shy. Land on the squat now, cheat. Come on, Gav. C7. Oh, that was a bad one.
So just having that little bit of camaraderie around it and that little bit of importance, rather than me standing there with my hands on my hips, the furrowed brow saying, can you fucking jump? I've got 5 or 6 guys standing behind him going like, you can't fucking jump. And that changes the complexion of everything that they're doing. Having that importance, having it explained to them, having little things like a WhatsApp message sent out to them the night before, being called a wizard by one of my back three, you know, just little things like that, they help. So what do we do? What do we actually do aside from just monitor this stuff? Number one, we start by explaining why. So we sit down, we explain why we do that. So everything that I showed you today, it's important that we capture on Monday because that's going to tell us a little bit about acute fatigue. It's important that we capture on Thursday because that's going to tell us a little bit more about your overall readiness. And we sit down and have those conversations as a group with individuals, and then we keep it important. And it's important not just to me and not just to the athletic performance department, but if you go back to that very first triangle, it's important to everyone. So our head coach will walk in halfway through our monitoring hour in the morning and stand there and cuss out guys who don't jump very high. And I've told him the 50 centimeter rule and how fatties aren't jumpers, and he loves that and he gets stuck into them. And medical guys come over and they want to know about that EMP, EDRFD ratio. See who they should be targeting to go and check and just get some hands on. We don't have a ton of staff. We've got 2.5 physios. One of them's part-time part-time academy. So she's split between 2 roles. So we've got to know who we're targeting, and that just gives us that little bit of insight there. Those guys buy into that. We've got our analysis department coming over and giving us video clips of guys who have been particularly explosive, lining that up with our GPS and then looking at their jump and saying like, hey, you're explosive, man, get up there, you can jump. We make it part of our everyday and we don't try to hide it. We want to make sure that they know that they're doing it and why they're doing it. And the guys, because we don't do a tremendous amount, they get into it. We create a competitive circumstance. So one of the things that started happening, I just noticed it about 6 months ago, was all our props were coming in early. And you guys have seen the 4Stakes leaderboard. So when you're the first one to jump, you're always in the top 10. And basically they were coming in early to do their jumps because they wanted to see how long they could stay in the top 10. And the last guy to still be in the top 10 was the winner. And, you know, the loser had to go and buy coffees or get them breakfast or, you know, got hosed down out the back or something like that. We give feedback and we give it often. So again, like if setting up a set of force plates and doing a counter movement jump twice a week is not an important thing to you, and you're not going to take the time to go and give that feedback and dive into some of this, and don't do it. Don't do it. Do something that is important to you. Do something that you are going to invest in. Go like if it's a drop jump and you can give really good feedback on a drop jump, or if it's an ash test and you want to know about shoulder stability, go and do that. Go and get it done. Like, don't force yourself into this, but do it because it's really, really cool and I like it. Get lucky on a couple. That's a good way to get some more buy-in. And then finally, again, make the complex simple. We explain all of that. We tell them about all these variables. We talk about this, you know, whole underlying mess of things that could be contributing to this performance. But what does it come down to? Is Mitchie standing there going like, right, I'm going to bang my fucking head off the roof on this one. And then get into the bloke next to you for not doing it. Cheers, guys. Thank you. Any questions for me? Yeah, shoot, go.
Yeah. Do you notice any major changes or fluctuations of reliability over the season or over the year?
Reliability, no. We do our test retest at the start. We do see fluctuations in all these variables. They do change depending on where we are. Probably the biggest one that I've noticed and why I referenced that, like do it at the same time. We had one day there a couple of weeks ago where we let the guys come in a little bit later and we jumped at 12 o'clock. And all of a sudden these jump heights and these RPDs are way up. I go, what the fuck's going on here? But they'd all slept in. They were really rested. So by changing that circumstance, it was, you know, it was a big change. Now, what did that teach me, and what was my chat with the head coach after that is, are we maybe missing a trick by starting earlier in the morning, and should we maybe start later in the day and train a little bit later? It allows us to ask a question. But we do see those fluctuations over time and throughout the year.
Because in rugby there's obviously big boys, outside backs, that sort of thing. Are you looking for different things in terms of different variables for different sorts of fatigue? You know, we've got collision-based fatigue, and then you're going to have outside backs that's going to manifest pretty differently. You look for different things for different groups?
Yeah, like for the bigger guys, more collision-based guys, I probably gravitate towards the eccentric measures because they seem to be the ones that drop when their soreness is up. So when I look at these things, I have sort of 2 pages open. I have my dashboard on where they are there neuromuscularly. I look at their perceptual wellness as well. I don't tend to look too much at GPS. There's a metric that StatSports gives us about HMLD that probably relates more to our outside backs and inside backs who do a lot of up and back, like half backs, sort of that up and back running, chasing rucks. When I look at the outside backs and that, I'm probably drawn more towards the concentric rate of power development, looking at whether their explosiveness is still in check. The ones that seem to be pretty constant for everyone are the ones that you'd think, so flight time, contraction time, concentric impulse. They're pretty steady measures. If I see big drop-offs in them, there's probably something decent going on with them. But yeah, the other one that Dan turned me on to is that eccentric deceleration impulse, and that seems to be almost universal across all these guys. As that starts to go down, like I start wondering immediately about their work eccentrically and what's going on joint-wise in their lower body. So if there's been any tweaks and turns and stuff like that. The one thing about Irish rugby and Northern Hemisphere rugby that's different from Southern Hemisphere rugby is like even our backs, like all the way out to outside centre, they still play a really collision-based game. Like they're high confrontational sort of positions still. It's only our back 3 who really are a bit We call them our skitteries, because they're skittery. They just fly around all over the place and run away from you.
So obviously, rugby's got the luxury of playing once a week. When you're in the NBA, you're testing Monday, Thursday with a fairly standard play on the weekend roster. What, if anything, changed when you were playing 3, 4, 5 times a week?
I think it's harder to get that, like to understand whether or not there's low frequency fatigue. So they're the times where you've got to try and find the opportunity for the players to do it. So your testing schedule gets way more spaced out. It's not going to be as regular as that. And I wouldn't pretend that you would be able to do that well in the NBA. What you would be able to do is probably track regular time points fairly well, and then look for those opportunities to test your lower frequency fatigue. I think that's where I want to understand a little bit more, and through this research, understand a little bit more around that CRPD type of metric, linking that back up with flight time, contraction time, RSI mod, whatever you want to call it, seeing what might be being affected by what and when. I know, so Blake's diving into it a little bit more at the moment, but that more consistent sort of testing schedule is probably more important rather than that, every, twice a week, every week type of model.
Dave, very good presentation, by the way.
Cheers.
Do you have a scale that you use to measure like perceptual fatigue? So when players come in, or you might share what?
Yeah. So in the background to all of this, so like at the very start there, we have our wellness monitoring. So that's every training day. So at least 3 days a week, we take our wellness monitoring. Happens to be on the same days that we jump. We collect RPE for every session. We have GPS on every field session. So RPE in the gym, on the field, everything, and we try to be as stringent as we can with the collection of that, so we're getting as close to a decent internal load measure as we can. We don't have heart rate, which might be something that's a nice little sort of physiological load, but we do collect those regular intervals of wellness and RPE.
What I'm curious of is, as you try to make sense of your high fatigue that we just expect to be there, and then why does low fatigue linger, or why does it last in some people longer than others? And I know you're getting some of this information about family situation, case study kind of work, but whether or not you could understand some of the patterns of why it's persisting with some people with that data by looking at them together cooperatively. Hopefully it takes me less than 2 years, otherwise Blake and Dan might kill me. That's actually part of that research. It's why I don't reference it much here, because I don't know yet. I can anecdotally say things like CRPD tends to go down as fatigue goes up. So we have just on our wellness questionnaire, we have a question about fatigue, and as they rate their fatigue higher, the CRPD comes down. The really interesting part about that is generally it tends to go down before their fatigue comes up. So it's just in advance, roughly a week. We see 2 persistent measures, and then we start getting these higher fatigue scores. Sickness is there before I've actually felt sick.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's a real good paper by Roger Anoka, who obviously does a lot of the work in fatigue and stuff, but it's really like the model for how you need to maybe look at your perceived fatigue in line with your with your actual performance-based measures of that. So
I like that.
if you haven't seen that,
No, I haven't. Would you mind?
Hugely helpful for you.
Would you mind shooting it over to me?
Yeah,
That'd be awesome. Cheers, Jay.
Just kind of following on from that, have you seen anything in terms of your GPS metrics, your RPs and things like that, in terms of how then you're modifying loads and then any reaction in the neuromuscular load and so on?
Typically on a Monday, I've got a head coach who's very oriented towards GPS. He's an Australian coach. He's been well educated, by his previous S&Cs and performance guys. So he's really highly oriented towards that. So we tend to manage, in my honest opinion, we tend to over-manage a little bit. So we probably do a little bit less than I'd actually like to, particularly intensity-wise. But what we do see is as some of those, those higher intensity sort of markers, so higher meters per minute, higher, metabolic load, distance per minute, whatever the fuck that is. But when they start to go up, we do start to see some of these, particularly for a length of time. If we do a 3-week increase, on that 3rd week, we do start to see some fatigue creeping in. The big one for us is where guys have physical games, so where their tackle counts are high, their ruck counts are high, and where they've been involved in a lot of, we might have a high scrum game for a prop. We start seeing those eccentric measures dropping off, particularly eccentric mean power.
How did you do that super maximal eccentric squat?
The super maximal, I'd have to get Johnny to explain it really well. So it's 120% of body weight, 2 reps, 2 sets after building up after 6 sets, building up weight. It was down to a box. We had 3 guys on the bar. This is the benefit of being in return to play protocol. You've got guys standing around who, they can't do a hell of a lot. So in between, they're sort of coming over and going like, yeah, we'll spot, this is good. So he loaded them up on a yoke bar on the old safety squat bar, and yeah, just hammered them out, screamed at him. Our strength and conditioning guy is an ex-Irish international. His nickname is Concrete because he's that fucking hard. Yeah, so if he's in the gym and he's in your face saying, fucking hold, do not touch that box, you're going to take 6 seconds, the boys are standing there going, yes, Johnny, yes, sir. Yes. And they take their fucking time. So they got after it. Yeah, they did a good job.
What does the communication look like? So on Monday, once you flag some guys, they're down, and then Thursday is your readiness, you got 2 days to try to get them back up. What is kind of the process in between that?
So on a Monday, if we see that they're down, if they're considerably down, we have a number of flags that are coming up just in that immediate instance. So that jump compared to their average, what does that seem to be? Number one, I'll go and see if it's persistent, if I've missed something, the week before. So that's my first checkpoint. Second checkpoint then is like, okay, it's down, it's only just then. What can we do in the next 24 hours before I re-jump them on the Tuesday to see if anything's changed? So if they are down, I want to check again the next morning, and we'll go and grab those guys that morning and say, hey, come in tomorrow morning, we'll just do another jump. We'll do another test and just see where you're at. If it's still down, it's still looking shitty, we'll adjust training on the Tuesday. Monday's a very light day. So Monday they might do walkthroughs, they might have some skill games, stuff like that, but they're not out there and running. They're not bashing each other up. They'll have a decent lift to try and push them up a little bit, have a good lower body lift, and then the next, that next day is their number one big training day. That's in the morning. So we'll manage that. If that jump is really high, we'll manage that. Now, if it's a matter of taking them all the way out of the session, it would want to be something that's fairly persistent. It might be a matter of rotating them a little bit more, working with the coaches to get them in and out of the session, giving them a little bit less load on the field. Wednesday's a rest day, so they go and do their regen all day Wednesday, come back in Thursday to see if we've corrected. My general rule of thumb is, and it's horrible, actually I should say heuristic, my rule of thumb is if I see them down 3 times in a row, persistently outside of that baseline, I want to have some sort of intervention, depending on what the measure is. So if it's more of an eccentric measure, I'm thinking around soreness and tissue quality, probably be a physio-based sort of intervention. If it's something more explosive, it might be a rest-based intervention. If it's something more impulse-wise, it might be a strength-based intervention where we're giving them a little bit more load in the gym. Cool? Lunchtime, let's get it.